Well, thank you, Jeff, and thank you very much, Lee, and everybody for the invitation to be here, and thank you for the hospitality. For those usually of my political ilk who think that the world came to the sort of grinding halt and collapse from the early 1980s onwards, they just never did Rotary dinners and lunches in the early 1980s. They have improved very substantially since those days, I have to say, from the sort of horrible bit of reheated beef with a bit of gravy, peas and mash, which was the standard fare when I was first doing Rotary Club functions in those days. New Zealand Post, as a very interesting business, by far the most interesting of all the state-owned enterprises, by far the most complex range of issues associated with it. And the energy companies, whether they're partially privatised or not, are simply sort of giant tolling operations, one could say, at the end of the day. It's a business which faces major challenges. Essentially, it's two businesses, Wellington Communications and Kiwibank, banking business. Wellington Communications just about breaks even, Kiwibank makes a profit, and at the moment is even actually wiping its own face in the sense it's generating some capital. They're joined by a shared common retail network. Both, however, are greatly affected by the growth of modern electronic communications and what's associated with that. They also share the impact of those changes. And both, contrary to what is often thought, are in highly competitive markets. The postal market has been deregulated since the early 1990s. The latter part of that, post still retains an effective monopoly of local delivery in most areas. I emphasise most areas, not all. We actually only take about 60% of the letters in at the other end. We deliver everybody else's letters as well. The parcels business, of course, is probably one of the most competitive businesses in New Zealand. Apart from the big two players, plus about 3 or 4 others, there's also a whole heap of local one-person businesses out there in courier businesses. The main communications side is really also itself 3 parts at the moment: letters, parcels, and what I might gently call other bits. The other bits are largely a series of partially successful, failed, abandoned attempts to enter the digital age by trying to find a digital business. And we've had quite a few failures in that area. Because, of course, Post is a large traditional business, and it's not the kind of business which generates new growth, new technology businesses. The culture is not that which will generate that kind of business, but it tried many times to do so and has fallen flat on its face on a number of those occasions. We then sell them on with greater or lesser losses. The letters issue is, of course, a very simple story. Hands all up all those who've written a letter to a friend or relative within the last 6 months to a year, or at least cover myself, more than 10 such letters within the last year. There won't be very many in this room. 30 years ago, everybody in this room would have put up their hand saying that they sent a letter to friends or relatives, and probably quite a lot of them within the previous year. People have opted for faster, more convenient and much cheaper forms of communication, and the ordinary letter cannot compete in that space. Per delivery point, that is largely letterbox or postbox for simple translation, we are going down a steady 10% per annum in the number of letters. We're already about half where we were 10 years ago, 10 or 12 years ago. That decline shows no sign of abating at all. There is nothing Post can do to suddenly get people to turn around and start sending lots of letters. They won't. Parcels is the big challenge. We are probably not getting our fair share of the increase in the parcels business. There may be good reasons for that. One is that actually quite a bit of the business has almost near sweated labour working in it. We pay slightly better, but when I say slightly better, our couriers, who are all self-employed contractors, get somewhere in the mid-60,000s a year for a 65-hour week, and out of that they've got to pay the costs of their own vehicle, etc., etc., etc. So it's not exactly a princely fortune that even in Post people are getting paid, and they are probably the best paid couriers in the country. But we are certainly determined to increase our share of the parcel market. Part of our strategy for that is also getting better contact with the main feeders into the market from offshore, plus some things we're doing within the domestic sector that I won't talk about today. That business makes a healthy margin, but not as big a margin as its major competitor by quite a fair amount. The other bits, things like localists and so on, as I've already covered. What it is, we basically discovered that for us digital is a platform for existing businesses. It is not an opportunity for a completely new kind of business that somehow grafts onto something that looks like Post in the past. Nobody has succeeded in doing that anywhere around the world. All the big competitors in social media, communicators, etc., have emerged from outside the traditional post office, postal systems around the world. So I think there's a clear lesson within that. We should simply stop wasting our time trying to find a new sort of white knight to appear in that regard. The answers in terms of controlling the postal side, particularly the letter side, is right-sizing the business. So obviously 1st of July this year in suburban New Zealand we moved to 3 days a week. Nearly everybody is on 3 days a week already, in the sense that they only get letters 3 days a week on average. And so many get actually less than that. It's a typical New Zealand story that people said, but what about those little old ladies who like to toddle down the driveway to go to their post box to see whether they got a letter? To which my usual, somewhat cruel answer was, well, they can still toddle down the post box to find that they've got post or not. It's just now in 3 days they have some chance they will, 3 days they know they won't get it. Whereas at the moment, by and large, 3 days they will not get it, but they don't know they're going to get it before they do the toddling. So unless we see this as a major form of exercise for the elderly, it's not really a powerful argument for not changing the distribution system. It has to be said. So that's one part of it. The second is moving to what we call a single delivery agent. You might start to see appearing soon various different kinds of bicycles, motorbikes, electric vehicles, all kinds of bits and pieces as we start to integrate what is our yellow business, Express Couriers Limited, with our red business, that is the traditional postal network, and continue to deliver in that way. Indeed, ironically, it would not surprise me if in 10 years' time we are back to delivering what few letters remain daily, because in fact they're being delivered through this combined courier business, which has got business running up and down. I mean, our couriers at the moment do an average of 3 runs a day around every area in the country. Rural is different, of course, because rural postal deliverers are the only ones who can deliver things other than letters and parcels. And that's in fact what keeps that part of the business viable and keeps those very important providers of services in the rural sector able to operate. What this will do in the longer term is raise an interesting question. If basically we can see a point where letters have basically disappeared, which is not an unrealistic prospect, or at least it's a kind of quaint legacy business operating along tourist trails or something of that sort, with all the sort of associated businesses with that. And basically we're a parcels business, either very quick or relatively slow, which is basically what we have at the moment anyway, with Pace, Ordinary ECL, and our ordinary parcels business. There will be an issue about what is the government doing owning a parcels business in a hugely competitive parcels market. Why should it expose itself to risk in a market of that sort? Wash your mouth out, Michael, as former Labour Party spokesperson on finance. Do not report me, please, to Andrew Little, or even worse, to David Cunliffe. But certainly I do think that issue will arise at some point in the future. In my view, it doesn't really make sense. I know some people still try to argue, largely employees of Post, that we are a social service, but my argument against that is no, we are simply a communications company in that regard, competing with lots of other forms of communication. There's nothing strangely social servicey about delivering letters compared with emails or whatever it may be. Kiwibank has a quite different set of challenges. Its challenges are growth, and the fact that it's grown much faster than initially anticipated, and that has also created for it difficulties around some of its current systems which are simply not fit really for the purpose of a large and increasingly complex bank moving into the future. Underlying it, however, is a longer-term strategic question, which is what is the potential role for Kiwibank in an economic sense within the New Zealand economy? That's a quite different kind of question from the question around parcels, etc., in my view. At the moment we've been through an extraordinary range of challenges in the regulatory and compliance environment. Anti-money laundering has been a huge cost for all banks, but particularly difficult for Kiwibank because, of course, we're on our own, whereas all our Australian-owned competitors, who all try to appear and pretend they're New Zealand banks, you may notice in their advertising, but all our Australian-owned competitors have their much larger Australian companies having had to go through exactly the same process. So they've been able to piggyback off their Australian owners in terms of the cost and complexity of introducing anti-money laundering procedures, which, of course, have been imposed from outside. I mean, these are not regulatory requirements generated from within New Zealand, they're generated by the United States. But you have to meet them, otherwise you find your access to overseas capital markets somewhat limited, to put it mildly. So that's been an issue for us. There was, I think, a tendency until very recently, last year or so, for Kiwibank to be a little bit sort of soft in its approach to the regulatory authorities. In other words, to not take some of the requirements too seriously. They've learnt from a number of sort of slaps on the wrist from a variety of regulators that that's not a very bright idea. You never win an argument with regulators, at least not in the New Zealand legal system anyway, maybe in the United States, but that's a quite different set of arrangements and assumptions around that. We've been growing rapidly. That's creating real problems of access to capital. At the moment, we remain primarily a retail bank servicing effectively provision of mortgages, and indeed in the immediate post-GFC period, 2009 into 10, we were for a period the largest supplier of new mortgages into the New Zealand market because the Australian banks have been ordered basically to withdraw back to home base to protect the home base. And we were the big active player at that point, which is worth thinking about if you think about selling Kiwibank in the future. Exposed. There are only a couple of countries in the world have the vast majority of their financial systems owned from offshore. It may well be that they're right and we have tended to be wrong in New Zealand in that regard. The present government is not prepared to put more capital into Kiwibank. The money communications side is no longer generating the spare cash flow to invest back into Kiwibank. We have put in about $400 million since Kiwibank was set up. The bank is now worth about $1.5 billion, so it's a reasonably good investment over that time. But we no longer have the spare cash. We cannot fund any further growth by Kiwibank out of mail and communications. Indeed, to some extent you could argue it's been propped up the other way around. Why not sell it to a willing buyer? The answer is as soon as that was floated at one post-budget session about 4 years ago, the switchboards lit up with people talking about withdrawing their money from Kiwibank. The fact that it is guaranteed to be New Zealand owned is part of its attraction for a very large proportion of our customers. It's what gives us our particular position. And indeed, in some ways, our real competitors are TSB and Southern Building Society rather than the bigger banks, although in terms of head-on competition, the closest to us is actually ASB in many respects. They have clearly targeted our market in many respects. The bank is also moving towards core modernisation, which is a matter of upgrading its clanky computer system, which was designed for Australian credit unions of up to 250,000 members, and we have about 900,000 customers now, and about half of those are main bank customers. So we bolted bits on and did this and fiddled that and done the rest of it. Now we have to actually do a new system. And particularly the strategy is what's called digital first, which is to become a leader, as we have been on occasions. We were the first bank in the world to have smartphone banking. We've not been a follower at all in these areas. We want to keep ahead of that and basically continue to migrate our customers onto a digital base. So that's where the digital comes back in. These are combined, these two systems, in a retail network, which people can understand why we go to 3 days a week, but having trouble understanding why we need to begin shrinking, rationalising in a variety of ways the retail network. But if we're not sending letters, you're not going and buying stamps to send letters. 90% of our transactional banking is now done online, which would probably be pretty typical of all the major banks. When we introduced not long ago the ability to effectively renew your mortgage online, we immediately got up to about 50% of people renewing their mortgages online. Again, from your personal banking perspective, not talking about any business banking, how many people now go into their bank branch? I can't remember the last time, and I think my chequebook has been sitting in the top drawer somewhere for about 3 years now, and I'm still trying to work through finishing that chequebook off. We just don't do that any longer. People aren't using that large amount of fixed capital stock called our retail network in the way they were. It's not a matter of closing branches wholesale everywhere. It is a matter, I'll just finish it. It is a matter, however, of right-sizing that, probably by doing a lot of stores in stores. Not our own shops, but a little bit in the store we do in our bits. Finally, what we'd like to do perhaps is think about how we have partners within New Zealand who would meet the government's requirement for no sale outside the Crown. On that cryptic note, I shall leave it open. No, not at this point. I mean, we don't see drones as actually being an effective replacement for most parcel delivery services. It'd be highly specialised, light objects, etc. In the same way that I'm personally highly sceptical about 3D printing as replacing the vast bulk of consumer goods. I mean, the notion that you'd have a machine your own sort of printing out a pair of undies rather than actually ordering them bulk from offshore just strikes me as slightly incredible, really. As long as they're prepared to stay in permanently. I mean, as soon as we lose any suggestion that those shares are sold, and we start to move down the track of privatisation and overseas ownership, then we have lost our competitive position within the market in terms of branding. Not necessarily in terms of everything else, but in terms of branding. And that's what's built the brand up over the years. And I should say that as one who was a sceptic about setting Kiwi Bank up in the first place. Yes. No. We have a deed of understanding. We have 2 ownership ministers and a regulatory minister, who is Amy Adams. That means that deed provides we have to have 270 full-service postal outlets around the country and another 600 various kinds of outlets. We at least get a stamp or things of that sort. It specifies how often we can deliver, etc., service standards of delivery, and so on and so forth. So we are constrained in that regard.
Do they allow you?
Yes, we have done that, but the problem is, of course, the more you increase that, the more you simply accelerate the decline in the use of letters anyway. So it's a bit of a tail-chasing exercise.